Hola, Econ peeps. Time for Module 11, a whole nother unit. For me, this is the real meat of macroeconomics. This is where all the stuff that we've been learning starts to really come together, in my opinion. So we're going to begin today with a discussion of fiscal policy. So this is the unit about policymaking, right? So we're going to do fiscal policy today, and then here in a little bit we're going to do monetary policy. But before we can talk about monetary policy, we need to talk about money and banking. So we're going to do fiscal policy today, money and banking, then monetary policy. And then we'll talk about some policy applications. But really, you're going to get some of that as we move through this material. Before we get there, I just want to remind you of some things. Okay? Recall that we talked about this. That is the fundamental equation of macroeconomics. That is output. That is GDP. That is aggregate expenditures, consumer spending, business spending, government spending, and net exports. Business spending is denoted I because it's primarily in money spent on capital investment, right? And then net exports over here is X minus M. Exports minus imports. To remember which one comes first because it's subtraction. There is no additive property in subtraction. X minus M is not the same thing as M minus X, right? Unlike X plus M, wouldn't matter if it was X plus M or M plus X. But when it comes to subtraction, no additive property. So we have to keep them in order. Here's how I would recommend you remember this. X minus M. Exports minus imports. In the alphabet, E comes before I. Now we use the letters X and M because the first syllable of each of those words happens to be the very same, those letters right there, X minus M. All right? And it's important to remember this. We're going to be using this aggregate supply and demand curve model quite a bit, I should say. Right? And remember that this is output. That is the same thing here. So why am I talking about this? Well, so we're starting with fiscal policy today. So fiscal policy primarily affects consumer spending and government spending. Now, I'm not saying that it has no effect on business spending, doesn't have any effect on net exports, because it does. It affects trade too. But it's primarily going to impact aggregate expenditures through consumer spending and business spending. And remember, any change in any one of these creates an even larger change in total output because of that multiplier effect. Well, in the coming days, we're also going to talk about monetary policy. Well, guess what? So monetary policy primarily affects business spending. Not exclusively. Again, it's a little bit of, it's a mixed bag, but it's primarily going to be affect the aggregate outcome, total output, via monetary, via business spending. Okay? And then these last two, net exports, X minus M, that's going to be what we call foreign exchange, or Forex. That'll be in the last couple of chapters, right? That'll be in the next unit, actually, when we cover the global economy, foreign exchange. Just remember this. Every single transaction that occurs between people in different countries, between different countries who are trading with one another, every single one of those transactions requires an exchange of currency. That's foreign exchange. Okay? All right. So, in other words, we're going to be moving through systematically how changes to these, C and G through fiscal policy primarily, I through monetary policy primarily, net exports through foreign exchange primarily, we're going to systematically move through the different things that causes this model here to change. I'm showing it at full employment output, right? Remember that. Here's the equilibrium price level. Changes in this mean inflation. Changes in this means output, and output moves in the opposite direction of unemployment. So if output increases, unemployment is decreasing, and vice versa. So all three of my big macroeconomic indicators are featured in that model. So that's really important. So we're going to systematically move through these different parts of the policy making, right, in order to show you exactly how, ceteris paribus, we can affect change in the economy. Whether we should is a different question, right? That's a normative issue. Okay. So fiscal policy is strictly government. It is changes to government spending, G, and changes to taxes, which primarily affect consumer spending. If you raise taxes, consumers have less money to spend. Increase in taxes, C goes down, output goes down by even more. You increase government spending, you increase output by even more. You decrease government spending, you decrease output by even more. You can also cut taxes. Now, here's the reality. And I think I've said this before, right? The fact of the matter is you rarely get one of these without the other. You're rarely going to get an increase in taxes without some reduction in spending. The reason being is because traditionally, your Republicans are going to be okay with lower taxes, but not okay with more spending. And Democrats, typically, are going to be okay with more government spending, but not reducing tax revenue. So, in order to raise taxes, the Democrats are going to need to get some Republicans to sign on, and to do that, they usually have to include some cuts to spending. Likewise, if the Republicans are wanting to pass a bill that involves reductions in government spending, they may have to offset some of that with increases in taxes to attract some Democrat support. Always prefer bipartisan, don't always get there, but the filibuster rule makes it impossible to pass anything without some bipartisan support. All right. So again, changes to federal government spending, changes to federal tax policy. Both of these require legislation to be passed. So this is legislative in nature. You can't change taxes without changing the law. You can't change government spending without changing the law. Now, there's some government spending that's already been passed, even though we don't know how much that is. Right? We have unemployment insurance, and they don't know from year to year how many people are going to file claims. It doesn't mean that if more people file claims and we spend more money on unemployment insurance, we need to pass a law to do so. That's already baked in. Right? Those are called, there's a name for those. Unfunded liabilities. Sorry, those are called unfunded liabilities. All right? Where they passed a law that says you're going to have to pay for this. We just don't know how much it's going to cost yet. All right? All right. So fiscal policy is one of the two primary mechanisms policy tools we have to manipulate, to control, to manage this economy, the other one being monetary policy. Congress, President, it's legislative. Okay? All right, so important to understand. So there's two components to our government budget. There are tax revenues, money the government brings in, and then there is spending, money the government spends. All right? The government does not make any money itself. I don't mean it doesn't print money. It can. The Treasury Department can. But it does not produce anything that it sells for a profit or anything like that, right? Two parts of the budget. Tax revenue and government spending. Now, a deficit occurs when the government spends more than it brings in tax revenue. A surplus, of course, is when it brings in more tax revenue than it spends. Typically, this is a sort of annual rite of passage in government budget. We run a deficit almost every single year. The only time in my lifetime that we've not had a deficit that I'm aware of is briefly in the late 90s, when we had a Republican Congress and a Democrat president. They found a way to work together, and they actually had a budget surplus. Then President Bush won, and he sent everybody a check because you gave the government too much money. Little did we know we probably should have used that money to pay down the debt, because shortly after that 9/11 happened, and we started spending a lot more money in the military. Nonetheless, and of course that raised the deficit even more. So, but this is not the same thing as total debt, right? So here's a way to think about this, okay? All right, so here's the way to think about this. Our deficit or surplus is this. Let me go ahead and make this big. Our deficit is just that T minus G there. Just this T minus G. If you add all of those up, you end up with total debt, right? If you don't know, this symbol here is the capital Greek letter delta, or excuse me, sigma, and it means summation. We're adding up. So you add up from some year I all the way through some year N. You take the taxes generated in that year, collected that year, you subtract the government spending from that year, and you add that up to the taxes collected the following year minus the government spending from the following year, and do that for the next year and the next year and the next year after that. And if you continue to do this, you'll find out that we have, let's go with greater than, if I'm not mistaken, this is right. Almost certain, probably closer to 25 by now. I'll show you how we know this in a moment. Our total debt is more than $20 trillion. That, by the way, is comparable to the size of our government. And most economic research suggests that once total debt exceeds 80% of total output, your economy really starts to slow down and you experience lengthy periods of slow growth. Okay? So this isn't good, and we're now probably closer to 110, 120% of GDP. Deficit occurs when spending exceeds revenue. Surplus occurs when revenue exceeds spending. Okay? All right. Hey, they didn't put any negative numbers on this pie chart. That's progress. All right. So here's the big spending category. There are 3 areas that the overwhelming majority of government spending happens. Defense, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Medicare, Medicaid is health care for elderly and poor people. Social Security is a government-mandated retirement system for when you get older, when you no longer can be productive enough to support yourself. This was come about in the 30s. Medicare, Medicaid was in the 60s, part of LBJ's war on poverty. And then, of course, national defense. And if you add all that up, you see that you're talking about almost, not quite, but almost 2/3 of everything the government spends is just in those 3 categories. Now, bear with me. Let's go take a look at, all right, take a look at this. I was a little exaggerated in my total debt calculation. It's much worse than I thought. This is usdebtclock.org. Tracks it. U.S. national debt is $30 trillion. Comes to almost $100,000 per person in the country. And it's quite a bit. And here's the revenue. We bring in $4 trillion in revenue. And here's our current budget items, right? This is unfunded debt here. Here's your Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense. Now, anybody who's suggesting that they can get this debt managed without doing something about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and national defense is simply whistling past the graveyard. There's something that has to be done there if we're actually serious about taking on the debt. This notion that we can just reduce waste and fraud and the rest of throughout the rest of government. Look, less than 1/3 of total government spending is everything else. Beyond defense, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and then the interest on the debt, because we borrow money to pay for things that we don't have the revenue for. So we owe interest on that. Take those out of it. You're left with 29%. That's everything else. That's all of Congress. That's NASA. That's the NOAA, the National Oceanic Association, Administration Association. All right, something like that. Everything else, everything. The U.S. Treasury Department, FBI, Supreme Court, right? Congress, everything else. Department of Energy, Department of Education, all of those. Every one of those is all in this other category over here. So if you're not doing something about this, and listen, I'm ex-infantry. I'm probably slightly more hawkish than you. I'm guessing. Maybe not. So I'm not a big fan of cutting our defense spending too much. I think we spent way too much time in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's absurd. But I'm not a big fan of cutting defense spending overall. Because there are threats, very real threats. We're seeing them now. We've got Putin doing some psychotic saber rattling talking about detonating nuclear bombs in Ukraine. And that's also talking about blowing up a nuclear power plant in Ukraine. In fact, Poland, I think it was, is giving out anti-radiation pills to all their citizens because they're worried about what's about to happen. So Putin's already made it clear he's more than happy to detonate a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine to win that war. And you got China helping, Iran. To me, that's our next big axis of evil, right? In World War II, you had Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now I think we have Russia, China, and Iran. Throw in some smaller places. North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela. Right? So, there are threats out there, is my point. I'm not a big fan of cutting national defense. But why can't we do something about the other ones? Well, it's not that people have not tried. I don't know if you remember this guy. His name is Paul Ryan. Name may sound familiar to some of you. Paul Ryan was elected, I want to say, out of the state of Wisconsin to the House in 06 or something like that, 07. And he was a backbencher, a low-tier guy, but he wrote a book advocating for the privatization, something that, by the way, Bush had tried to do just a few years earlier, wanting to privatize Social Security and health and Medicare and Medicaid, get them off the government books and turn them over to the private sector to manage, which isn't a terrible idea. It comes with risks, there's no doubt about it. But this is pretty risky too. But nonetheless, we'll leave the actual merits or lack thereof of that debate to their own devices. It didn't happen, by the way, obviously. So, but he was advocating for it. And by 08, this had become a bit of something relevant to the presidential campaign. Now, for those of you who don't know Paul Ryan then in 2012 became the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party when Mitt Romney won the nomination in 2012. They lost that election. President Obama had 4 more years, right? And then in 2016, guess what? Shortly before that election, he was asked and agreed to serve as the Speaker of the House of the Republican majority. I think that was actually beginning of 2014. And then he left in 2018, I guess. He stopped. He did not want to do anymore. And he's now retired living in Wisconsin. And he's kind of moved quite a bit off the place that he was back in 08. Just to give you some background, just to give you some idea of who this guy is. All right? So that's Paul Ryan. In 08, he was most known as someone who had been recently elected to Congress and was advocating for the privatization of health care and Social Security. I want to say during the 2008 presidential cycle, an ad ran. This is pro-Democrat, anti-GOP ad. This is not a Funny or Die skit. It was not an SNL ad. This was an ad that people paid to have put on television so people could watch it. All right, so you think Paul Ryan got a few phone calls when this ad was running? They gave out his number. It's pretty cynical, to be sure. Very clever. Very clever. And effective. Right? That's why we don't have privatized Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, right? Or at least arguably that would be one of the reasons why. It did a good job. It's fear-mongering, to be sure. Both sides do it well, let's be honest. This isn't just, one side doing that. Both sides do this. And I always love showing this in class when I can see the students, because there's a combination of reactions. Some of them are just aghast. Right as they come up to the cliff, they're like, surely he's not going to throw the old woman off the cliff. And when they do it, you see them kind of, right? Others are too busy laughing to really get it. And then some are got this sort of uncomfortable laugh where they don't know whether it's meant to be funny or what to make of it. Okay? So that's what happens when you try to fix Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. There's also, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a TV show called West Wing. There is an episode in season 5 called Slow News Day. Watch that. It's on, you can buy it for like $1.99 on Amazon Prime Video. You don't have to have Prime membership to get the video. $1.99 for a video, for one episode, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe $2.99 if you want the high-end version. But it's called Slow News Day, season 5. Really worth watching because it shows you just how much partisan chicanery is involved in trying to fix that, and it needs to be fixed. All right, they're estimating right now that Social Security will be bankrupt, but by 2033. And guess what that year is? That's the year I turned 65. So, come on, guys, get on the ball and fix that for me, would you please? I'm an old man here. I'm going to need this. All right. So here's the problem with the budget, and it's not insignificant. Contrary to others who say, oh, it doesn't matter, you can spend as much as you want, that's just simply not true. There are implications to this, very serious implications, and we're likely to be experiencing some of these for a while. Again, the research is pretty consistent that when you have a high debt to GDP ratio, 80% or higher, then you start experiencing slower economic growth. And this has been a consistent sort of a trend for years now. And it's not just because here in America, I'm talking about globally. Japan went through the same thing, arguably still are. Other countries have likewise experienced it. When your debt exceeds 80% of your total output, then you start having problems growing your economy. That's the argument. But we can't seem to stop the partisan nonsense long enough to actually have a serious conversation on that, what really is driving government spending. All right. Then you have state and local government spending, right? And this is a big deal. This is tied into property rights and, property taxes and all of that stuff. And I'm not a big fan of property taxes. I think I've said it before. I'm not a fan of turning the government into my landlord. I don't like that. That's not ownership to me. Are you really buying a house if you have to pay the government every single year for the privilege of owning it? That's not really ownership in my book. What's next? We're going to start have other kinds of property taxes. How about property tax on your TV? Property tax on your car? So anyway, so spending by state and local increased about 10% of GDP in the early 60s. It's now 14 to 16%. Then it went up, and it's been about 45% of GDP in recent years. So this is education spending is the biggest part of any states and local government spending, and that's where most of our property taxes are at least supposed to go to. I think, generally speaking, they do. Here's the problem with all of this, and I may have said this before, but again, any agency that is funded by the government has no incentive to keep costs down. Their incentive is to maximize cost. They want to spend as much money as humanly possible because at the end of the year, if they haven't spent all the money they were allotted, they were budgeted, then the people who are in charge of providing that money to you are going to say, oh, well, we must have gave you too much of it, so we'll give you less this year. So their entire incentive, or at least that's the assumption being made. I don't know if that would actually happen, but that's the assumption. So everybody, every agency, every government-funded agencies, from schools to community colleges, anybody that receives tax dollars, Their incentive is to maximize the cost. Spend every dollar of it so at the end of the fiscal year, you can go back to those who budgeted it for you, hat in hand, and say, see, you didn't give us enough. We need more. And it creates this never-ending cycle of taxes constantly going up. And there's no end in sight. The problem with this is tax rates have a very real upper bound. Right? You can only raise tax rates so high. Literally has a very finite upper bound. And so it forces them to come up with new clever ways to extract your productivity from you. That's how property taxes came about in the first place. We didn't always have property. So, all right, that's one of the reasons, for example, why the current Treasury Secretary under Biden, his name is Pete Buttigieg. He was the mayor in Iowa, maybe Des Moines, Iowa, or something like that. He ran for president in 2016. He was the first openly gay candidate for that particular office. And he's currently the Secretary of the Treasury under President Joe Biden. And he floated, they call it a trial balloon, just kind of putting it out there to see what the reaction would be. But he floated the idea, and this has been around for a while, so it's not his, but he kind of renewed it, of taxing drivers for every mile they drive, adding a per mile drive tax, right? As a way of, again, getting more revenue for the government. It's never going to end if you don't end it. They're never going to have enough because, again, everybody they give money to intentionally wastes as much of it as possible so that they always need more. That's the challenge, right? All right, so let's move forward. Ability to pay principle. This is one of those value judgments, right? This is citizens with more income or wealth should bear more of the cost of social programs by paying a higher tax rate since they have a greater ability to pay. I don't think there's necessarily a problem with that. Generally, we call this a progressive tax system, where as your income goes up, you pay a greater share of your income. We'll get into that more. The benefit principle is another one of these value judgments that says taxpayers should pay in proportion to the benefit they receive. I think it's fair to suggest that we should all have a little skin in the game. But, corporate income tax is a tax imposed on corporate profits. Estate and gift tax is a tax on people who pass assets to the next generation, either after death or during their life in the form of a gift, or what do they call it, a bequeath? It got bequeathed? I don't know what the proper form of that word is, but right? Again, many of these came about as a result of the overwhelming need to get more money. And they know that they can't just keep raising your income tax because there's only so high they can raise that. Excise tax, which is a tax on a specific good. We have excise taxes on gasoline. We have an excise tax on tobacco. We've talked about that when we were talking about elasticity. A flat tax. Some advocated a flat tax in 1996. His name's Forbes, Michael Forbes or something like that. But he ran for president, and he advocated a flat tax, and that's basically everybody pays the exact same share. I want to say at that time that would have, in order to fund the government at the current levels, it would have required a flat tax of 15 to 20%. Every single person, no matter how poor they were, no matter how rich they were, they paid 15 to 20% of their income, and everybody just moved on about their day. Okay. And then there's the individual income tax, which is based on income and received by individuals. Let's see if there's any more of these. Yeah, there's a few more. Good. Marginal tax rate. Now, this is an important idea. The marginal tax rate is the tax rate paid on additional income. Okay? Believe it or not, because again, they're constantly on the look for finding new ways of taxing people, of taking more of your productivity. Because they know a single tax rate has that finite upper bound. They can only go so high before before you get to 100% of a tax rate, it's going to be much worse than that. Because as you continue, at some point, you raise taxes so high, the argument is, not my argument, economic theory called the Laffer curve, but there's a theory out there that says if you raise tax rates too high, then you're going to create such a disincentive for people to work that fewer people will work, and you actually bring in less revenue. Even though you're taxing them at a higher rate, you're going to have less revenue because there are few people working. So long before you reach that upper bound of a tax rate, you're going to start running into some problems. So again, in their infinite quest to find new ways to take care of everybody else's money, they actually tax corporations for hiring. It's called the payroll tax. All right? Payroll tax is a tax based on the pay received from employees. This is how they fund Social Security and Medicare. Every person they hire, they have to pay a tax. The corporation does. The employee pays half that tax. So there is a tax on hiring and a tax for being hired. It's kind of dumb to me. Again, a progressive tax is a tax that collects a greater share of income from those with high incomes, or a greater share of revenue, I should say, from those with higher incomes than those with lower incomes. A property tax is a tax based on the value of your home or the real estate. Sooner or later, I'll bet money they're going to have to extend this to other private property. It's just inevitable. There's no way around it. A proportional tax is a tax that's a flat percentage of income earned, regardless of the level of income. It's another way for doing flat tax. A regressive tax is a tax on people with, basically when people who have lower income pay a greater share of their income in taxes than people with higher income. That's regressive. That's the opposite of progressive, right? Then a sales tax is a percentage of one's retail purchase. You've heard me say that corporate taxes are nothing but a regressive tax on consumption. All right, because everybody has to buy some stuff, and when you tax corporations and that gets passed on to the consumers, now you're paying that tax. All right. Here's tax revenue. Most of it comes from federal tax receipts. There's individual income taxes. There's your payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, excise taxes. And by the way, the payroll tax that covers Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, they voted 30, 40, 50 years ago to go ahead and start rating that and use that money to spend now. So when we say that Social Security is going to go bankrupt, that's part of the problem. They took that money and spent it. But there's another problem, right? When Social Security was created back in the 30s, there was like 8 people working for every one person who was retired and drawing money from the Social Security fund. So there were 8 people working and paying into Social Security for every one person who was retired and taking money out of Social Security. Guess what? Now that ratio is fewer than 2 workers for every 1 retiree. So it's a big problem. And then money raised from excise tax, money raised from corporate income tax. All right, progressive, proportional regressive taxes. Again, it's progressive if you pay a higher marginal tax rate as your income goes up. It's proportional if you pay the same regardless of what your income is. And it's regressive if you pay less as your income goes up. You pay less of a share, less tax rate, a lower tax rate as your share goes up, as your income goes up. All right. Again, the main revenue source for states and local governments is going to be sales taxes, property taxes, and then some revenue gets passed along by the federal government. All right. Sometimes there's also personal corporate income taxes associated at the state and local level. We don't have them here in Texas, but other states do. Some states like us rely more on property taxes, some on sales tax, some on income taxes. Some rely on revenue from the federal government. National debt, as you can see, this is a huge problem. As a percentage of GDP. This now, because of the pandemic and other spending, this is from the financial crisis. This is from World War II. Right? We were much more in debt, but we did get out of it. And here's that brief period in the 90s where we had surpluses. So it looks like we had a surplus in the 60s once, maybe in the 50s a couple of times. But all the other years in between, we've been running deficits. And so here's the financial crisis, boop, and now we were still below run deficit. Now it's probably back down here. Again, I don't know how you have a negative percentage of GDP. That doesn't make any sense to me. That's just a poorly done graph. There's a way of showing this, but hold on. Here is U.S. 123.6%. That's the debt to GDP ratio. I don't know where they're getting these numbers here, because everything I have seen has shown this. All right. So, again, federal debt, the total debt is the sum of annual budget deficits and surpluses. That's what I showed right here. Right? That the sum of those of T minus G every year. Whatever that number is, you add it to the next number you get when the next year and so forth and so on, and you get total debt. Okay? Most economists view the proposals for a perpetually balanced budget with bemusement. There is zero basis to put such a thing in a class, in my opinion. Whether economists are bemused or not is irrelevant to the study of the macroeconomy. So that's just a little too self-serving. That's just a vanity exercise on the part of the people who put this together. We'll talk about automatic stabilizers here coming up pretty quick. There are people who want a balanced budget amendment, meaning that every single year we have to have a balanced budget. Even if we don't stick to it, we have to have one. That creates a problem because of the cyclical nature of the economy. So does spending incessantly. It's too bad economists don't see all the spending and 120% of GDP in bemusement. Perhaps we wouldn't be here if they saw that with bemusement. All right, so automatic stabilizers. This is the tax and spending rules that have the effect of either slowing down or speeding up the economy based on its current cycle. So when the economy contracts, more people are going to be out of work. The unemployment rate is going to rise. They're going to apply for benefits. That spending, I told you, has already been spent, already been allotted. You have to pay for people's unemployment if they qualify. And so that's an example. So government spending, when the economy contracts, government spending is going to increase. Similarly, because there's fewer people working, tax revenue is going to fall. So government spending increases, tax revenue fall, the deficit gets worse, grows the debt. But then when the economy starts growing again, guess what? Fewer people needing government resources means the government doesn't have to spend as much on welfare or transfer payments, as we call them. And there are more people working and being productive, and there's more tax revenue coming in as a result. That's what we mean by automatic stabilizers. It's the policies, it's the spending rules and the taxes that can keep aggregate demand from falling too far, and keep the aggregate demand from going too fast, without having to pass new laws or anything, right? So there's discretionary fiscal policy. This means that the government has to make a decision to make a new law. It's in their discretion whether or not to raise government spending. It's their discretion whether or not to raise tax rates, right? That's discretionary fiscal policy. There's two types of discretionary fiscal policy we're about to be talking about, called expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy. Okay? We'll get into that. And this idea of standardized employment budget, also known as the cyclically adjusted budget, is nonsense. This is econ double speak for, oh, don't worry about the debt. We're going to pretend and massage the numbers so it don't look as bad. Again, if there wasn't a problem with how much spending, why would we need to do something like this? I find that just nonsense. It's just a silly thing that economists have invented to try to distract us from the problems with accumulating too much debt on a national scale. Okay? So again, automatic stabilizers include those things like unemployment insurance. When you lose your job, you can apply for unemployment. Maybe you need help buying food. You got food stamps, right? Likewise, the tax rate. The taxes qualify as automatic stabilizers. Again, when the economy contracts, people lose their job, tax revenue is going to fall. But when the economy starts growing, more people go back to the workforce, tax revenue rises. All right. And these things can kind of it's not that they automatically kick in, because you do have to apply for them, but they're available to you when you experience that kind of hardship, and it does help the economy from getting too bad, right? Remember what I told you. The problem that I have anyway, with not having any kind of real safety net, is that I worry that, again, when the economy contracts, consumers spend less. When consumers spend less, producers don't need to make as much stuff. If they're not going to need to make as much stuff, they don't need to employ as many people. So they have some layoffs. And guess what? Unemployed people spend even less money than they did before. So producers need to make even less, and so forth and so on. And it creates this negative feedback loop where this decline in consumer spending produces an increasing decrease in output, and that feeds right back into the system and produces even less spending and even less output, which goes right back in there and produces and so forth and so on. That's the problem with, that's the concern I think most economists would have if we did not have some sort of social safety net. You can argue about its robustness or lack thereof, that's for sure, but at a minimum, unemployment. And the reason why I would say that is because in the absence of something like that, how does the person, how do they keep from losing their house and their home? And if they don't have a house and a house and a car, if they don't have transportation and a place to live, how are they supposed to go find another job when the economy gets better? So that's my spiel on that, for what that's worth. Contractionary, expansionary. So if you want consumers, if the economy is growing too fast, we have what we call demand pull inflation, right? In other words, there's too much money chasing too few goods. You have a situation where the economy is growing faster than what you want. Contractionary fiscal policy would, at least in theory, fix this. So you want to slow the economy down. You want less output. You can raise taxes. Raising taxes gives consumers less money to spend. Consumers spend less. Output falls by an even greater amount. All right? Government could also decrease spending. Cut spending, lower G, lower output. All right? Expansionary, when the economy contracts, when we have a recession, then expansionary fiscal policy is an option, right? So we can cut taxes so consumers have more money in their pocket to go spend. That'll help grow the economy out of this hole, right? They could also increase government spending. There's a catch with increasing government spending we're going to talk about. It's something called the crowding out theory, if you will. It's called crowding out. All right. So expansionary fiscal policies would be increasing consumption by raising, by reducing income tax, increasing investments by raising after-tax profits through cuts in business taxes. Okay, they're a little silly. That's not going to do much. Businesses don't spend that much to begin with. It's primarily consumer spending. So the big change would be to cut their taxes. But you can also increase government spending. Okay, and this is important. Here's right here. This is where we want to be. We want to be here at full employment output, where all three curves intersect. Here's short run, here's long run, and here's my aggregate demand curve. They all intersect right here at E1, and that's where we want to be. But the economy has grown too far. Where's my cursor? It's gotten ahead of it. We need to close this. This is what's known as an inflationary gap, and we need to close that gap. Right? You can raise taxes. Consumers have less money to spend. That's going to reduce output. Aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. Close up that gap. Okay? That would be contractionary fiscal policy. They did not put a similar one in here for, I don't know why, but they didn't put another one in here for expansionary, but it's the opposite of that. Right? It would be an inflationary gap. That's an inflationary gap, a recessionary gap that you're trying to grow your way out of. Okay? From a neoclassical, that stuff, the fiscal policy tends to be largely Keynesian in nature. So from a neoclassical perspective, the focus is on reducing budget deficits and reducing government spending and regulations to help producers be more efficient, because they're the ones creating the jobs, and the better their life is, the better it is for everybody else. So the argument goes. Crowding out. This is this idea, and you're going to see this in a little while. Okay? We're going to talk about this in more detail in just a minute. But crowding out means that when the federal government spends money, it causes interest rates to rise. And remember, interest rates are the cost of borrowing money, usually for businesses, for everybody, but especially businesses. So now, when the government has spent money causing interest rates to rise, that's going to inevitably cut down on business spending. So you're going to get some growth in government spending, but you're going to get less business spending. And most economists would suggest that businesses and markets, free markets, are a much better gauge of where and when and why and how to spend than the government is. Crowding out. We'll get into this more in a moment. Then there's the flat tax, income tax. We already talked about that. I'm not sure why it's here. There's the Laffer curve I mentioned earlier. This is the idea that if tax rates are too high, creates a disincentive for people to work. And so the government can raise tax rates so high that they actually start reducing tax revenues because fewer people will go to work. Remember that multiplier effect. It's important. The idea that a change in spending causes an even greater change in total output. Reaganomics is another word for supply-side economics, as is trickle-down economics. It's the same thing. Supply-side economics is the idea that, again, if you cut regulations, if you cut corporate taxes, if you reduce regulations that slow down the private sector, doing those things will increase economic activity in a healthy way, right? Tax cuts on personal income increases labor supply. Tax cuts on savings increase money that people save. Tax cuts on investments increase money people invest, right? So that's the idea. Now, I know some people out there are saying that trickle-down economics, supply-side economics, Reaganomics has been proven to not work. This is absolutely demonstrably false. Listen, there's a time for Keynesian, there's a time for neoclassical. They both have their advantages. The current situation, I'm arguing more for neoclassical than the Keynesian side. For the situation that was occurring back in the 2008, I think it was more Keynesian. I think we need more demand, issues with demand. But with this current situation, I think it's supply-based. I think we need to increase the supply of energy at all costs. Sorry, because this is going to get really bad. I've already talked about that. It's going to get bad, I think. I'm almost certain. Supply-siders argue that labor supply is determined by wages and salary after taxes are removed. So if you reduce taxes, you increase labor supply. Saving is determined by after-tax return of saving. In other words, you reduce the taxes on your wealth levels, then people will save more. Similarly, if you reduce taxes on business spending, then they will spend more money. Right? I don't think the Laffer curve is controversial. It's just a fact. People don't like it, to be sure. People don't like supply and demand. People don't like debts. People have all kinds of opinions about that. It's not controversial. They just don't like it, and so they argue about it and stuff like that. But it's not. He's got Arthur Laffer. That's the guy's name who came up with. He's got a very valid point. I think most economists would acknowledge that there's something to that. Where that point is, there's arguably some optimal level of tax rate that will provide the greatest return to government in the form of higher tax revenues. That's the point. Because at some point that's going to peak as it starts to come back down. You get negative returns to increase tax rates. All right. So examples of government spending: Head Start program, early childhood education directed at families with limited educational financial resources. I don't think this is a bad idea, but it has not shown any significant improvements in the standing of the kids that go through Head Start opposed to those who haven't. The research I've seen, and remember my doctorate degree is educational leadership policy studies, not economics, but the research I've seen into the efficacy of the Head Start program has not been persuasive that it's a good use of federal dollars. But at the same time, it's kind of almost a necessity at this point for poor families to have a place for their kids to go so that they can go out and get a job. I hope that doesn't sound terrible. And then, of course, infrastructure. This is another area that I think most people would agree. Government can certainly help with building roads and better transportation. You get good returns from that, right? So let's talk about let's talk about crowding out. All right. I don't like where they put this in here. All right. So in order for us to talk about crowding out, I need to talk about interest rates. Because remember what I said, the argument about crowding out is that when government goes to spend money, they cause interest rates to rise, and the higher rate of interest means that businesses are going to borrow less money because it costs more now to borrow. And so even though G goes up, I goes down. And so you're really not making much progress. You crowded out business spending that might have otherwise occurred. All right. So there are two, generally speaking, when we talk about interest rates, there are two models that we use for this. One's called the liquidity model. I may have already showed y'all part of this, right? One's called the liquidity model. For reasons outside the scope of this class, you'll learn this in an intermediate macro class, but suffice to say, just trust me when I tell you that the money supply curve in the money market is vertical, right? And so this is known as the liquidity model or the money market model, right? This is the money market. Demand, of course, is downward sloping, and over here we have interest rates, right? And you'll see that well enough. Sorry, my mic is kind of in my way here. All right, so here's liquidity, all right? And here's the equilibrium interest rates. And here's the equilibrium quantity of money. Then there's the loanable funds model, right? And that's just what it sounds like. It's money that's available to be loaned, right? So again, and I didn't do this, I should have. It too has an equilibrium interest rate and an equilibrium quantity, right, of loanable funds. These are the two models that help us determine interest rates. So there's another idea called investment demand, right? Remember, investment is business spending. So what is the current level of demand for business spending? Just how much money are businesses demanding to spend and that they have to borrow, right? Well, so here, let's start with the liquidity model. So here's my liquidity model. Here's the equilibrium rate of interest. And as I connected from where they intersect here, and as I move all the way across here, look, that's where my equilibrium quantity of investment demanded. That's the equilibrium rate for quantity of investment demanded. That's I. That I is this I right here. Right? Can you see it? It's that I right there. It is the exact same I that appears in our fundamental equation of macroeconomics, right there. You change this, by changing this, you change this, which causes output to change by even more. So let's take a look. This is what the whole idea of crowding out is saying. To the extent, so the government's going to spend some money. The argument is primarily related to if the government has to borrow money to spend, and because we spend more than we raise in interest in tax revenue, we tend to, we're always running these budget deficits, so we tend to need to borrow money to spend more. So to the extent that the increase in government spending is the result of having to borrow money, the net result of that, and you can do this one of two ways. The government's either demanding more money or they're reducing the supply of money, right? They're taking money that would otherwise have gone somewhere else. But let's go with the demand side. They've increased the demand for money. And when they do that, I have a hard time seeing exactly, so I need to be over here. All right? When that happens, right, increase the demand, that's a rightward shift of my demand curve. All right, it's now intersecting my supply curve in a different place, in a higher place. And so interest, let me draw an up arrow there for interest. So interest has now gone up. Golly, I keep falling off my page here. So interest has now gone up here, right? And then you can see where we're now intersecting the investment demand curve, because that's a downward sloping curve to denote that inverse relationship between interest rates and the quantity of investment demanded. That's the whole idea. Higher interest rates creates a disincentive for businesses to borrow that money to spend on capital goods, and that's what I means. All right? So this is going to cause I to fall. So, the first thing that happened was the government increased spending. The government increased spending. All right? That's going to cause, when G goes up, Y goes up. But it goes up by even more. So aggregate demand increases. Price level goes up, output increases. There's that. You see that? There's the new aggregate demand curve as a result of an increase in government spending. The problem is, because our government didn't have the money to spend, they had to go borrow the money to spend. This caused interest rates to rise. Interest rates rise. Creates a disincentive for businesses to borrow. So at some point, business spending is going to fall, causing output to fall by even more. All right. And I put the second AD curve up here. All right. Label up here, but you can see what's happening. Right. So output fell in this case. Right. So we're right here, and output went backwards as a result of business spending falling, causing output to fall by even more. So you've offset much of the benefit you got from that government spending. You've crowded out private sector spending that could have been a much greater benefit to the economy, or so some would argue. We'll leave that up to you as to what you think, but that's the argument using the liquidity model. It's virtually the exact same thing for the loanable funds model, right? Here that is. And you can see here's the equilibrium interest rate. It's very simple, basic supply and demand, just like you would normally see. Downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, labeled loanable funds, LF, right? And again, here's where the equilibrium rate of investment demanded is, the quantity of investment demanded, okay? So the government increases spending, causing the aggregate demand curve to shift rightward, right? But when they do so, they're demanding more loanable funds. Hey, I need this money. Loanable funds is going to shift out, causing interest rates to rise, causing investment spending to fall, right? So here's their additional increased government spending, but as a result, interest rates went up, causing the quantity of investment demanded to fall. Lower I, lower Y. Higher G, higher Y. But then we have lower I, lower Y, less output. And that's going to push that aggregate demand curve right back. Let's say it does it even more this time. And you basically offset all the benefit that you got from that increase in government spending. So when you change government spending, there can be a catch to it. At least to the extent their argument is this only applies to money that's being borrowed. I don't think that's necessarily true. Money is money, whether it's been borrowed or not. If they're demanding more money, that's less money that's available. It doesn't matter whether we had the money already or whether they had to go borrow it. To me. But that's okay. I'm not going to argue over the finer points. I think crowding out is a legitimate concern when it comes to government spending. You run the risk of basically pushing private sector spending off the economy. Okay? All right. That's crowding out. So typically, expansionary fiscal policy means an increase in the budget deficit. That's not necessarily true. If you're running a surplus, it may just reduce the surplus. So it only increases the budget deficit if you already had a budget deficit. It's definitely going to expansionary fiscal policy is definitely going to increase government spending. So a higher G is being subtracted from your tax revenue regardless. So either your surplus is going to be smaller or your deficit is going to be larger. All right? But it's not guaranteed that you're going to have a thing that's going to increase the budget deficit. Okay? So in this expansionary fiscal policy, to the extent that it's being financed by borrowed money primarily, but not exclusively, I don't think, but primarily being financed through borrowed money, it may interfere with the private sector spending its own money. Okay? All right. Again, I think most people would agree that investments in physical and human capital and technology, there's good, effective, efficient use of government money. We're not always keeping an eye on the store, though. We don't do a really good job of keeping up with that. But you can see there is some reasonable expenses, reasonable ways of spending tax dollars that I think even the most ardent libertarian might go, yeah, I'm okay with that. I don't know. I'm pretty fiscally conservative, I would say, but I'm okay with some of it. All right. And there's the end of our chapter. So that wasn't too painful, right? I mean, I know I had to break off on a lot of side discussions to kind of explain some of these concepts because I think they're important. But that's our first unit in this, first module in this unit related to policy making. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions. Don't hesitate to email me. Otherwise, folks, be safe, be kind, and have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.